let's talk about Arthas, who is the best character Warcraft ever had. Despite how much Warcraft 3 changed the story of the Warcraft franchise until that point, it also came with a set of characters that people have grown to love over the years. But from all that ensemble of characters that, the game came with, there is none more important to the story and to the universe of Warcraft than Arthas Menethil. Until Dawnstar made sure to erase him so he can indulge in his fantasy of being Nathanos while sleeping with his undead waifu Dakimakura. We will not comment on how he indulges in his fantasies because YouTube would age restrict this video. But just know it involves lotion and back and forth motions. Maybe even a sock. Now that I got that off my chest, it's time to talk about Arthas and his inspiration. Now, the first inspiration is Arthas' class, the Paladin. And okay, this isn't just an Arthas thing, it's a thing for the whole class that existed since Warcraft 2. So let's begin with the real world Paladins, and we'll go a little through their inspirations, history and stuff. Paladins are basically Arthurian knights, but instead of serving King Arthur, Paladins serve Charlemagne. Originally, the Paladins started out as just simple knights that fought the Muslim invasion into Gaul, but thanks to Italian writers in the 15th or 16th century, around there, they started to get more supernatural elements added into them. But you see, it's not this Paladin, this Charlemagne Paladin, that is the inspiration for Arthas and his class, is the D&D Paladin, who got inspired by the Charlemagne Paladin. Since the creators of the original Warcraft were nerds that enjoy D&D, it makes sense that they've got inspired by the game and how the RPGs portrayed the Paladins. And of course, it's more based on the Italian variant of them. Nevertheless, it's important to note this is just so we can mark everything down properly. We gotta also talk a little bit about the boring stuff until we get to the good stuff. Well, let's go to something that many of you probably have already seen or already probably know. The Arthurian legends. Of course, you have Arthas and Uther. Well, Arthas and Arthur, Uther the Lightbringer and Uther Pendragon. The names fit. Besides the names, let's look at one of their main similarities of Arthas and Arthur. They both pick a sword that will make them kings in the end. Now, in Arthurian legends, Excalibur and the sword in the stone are the same or are different, or they share the same name because they are legends made through a vast span of time with a bunch of writers working on them. But for this video, we'll just call it Excalibur and refer to both of them as that. Both Excalibur and Frostmourne are swords that stand in wait for the rightful owners to come and claim them. Arthas and Arthur reach their swords alongside their mentors. Arthur, of course, with Merlin, and Arthas with Muradin. But in Arthas' case, his mentor does not come back from this trip alongside him. After they both grab their swords, they become kings when their father dies. Well, fathers die. But in Arthas' case, he makes sure his father gets in the grave before his time. Now, there is a parallel to be made between Arthur's quest for the Grail and Arthas going to the Frozen Throne. Arthas reaches the Frozen Throne and becomes the Lich King. Now, some would consider this is true ascension to becoming a king. While Arthur's story diverges a little, it changes. You have the whole Lancelot and Guinevere thing happening depending on the story. Also the Mordred thing, who is either his nephew or his son. Yeah, Arthur's story gets more complicated depending on what versions we're looking into. But I think it would be a fair parallel to consider Arthas becoming the Lich King with Arthur getting Excalibur fixed by the Lady of the Lake. But there is something glaring back at us when making this comparison. Arthas isn't as good as Arthur. Hell, after he grabs Frostmourne, he leaves on his path nothing but devastation. And thanks to that, I have seen on the internet at least one person that says that Arthas was inspired by Anakin. They both have blonde hair, they're strong in the Force / light, they are members of a knightly order, and they fall to evil. And they both destroy everything they once sought to protect. Now that's interesting, I know, but there are a few glaring problems. Now, if your only experience with stories comes from Star Wars and Marvel, you would be correct to say that this comparison is justified. Except that you would be wrong. Warcraft 3 was released on the 3rd of July 2002. Revenge of the Sith, which is when Anakin's fall happens, would be released in 2005. Now, if we go to Attack of the Clones, let's see, that's where it started. That appeared in cinema in the same year as Warcraft 3, 1 month earlier. And we know that Melton has been working on Warcraft and its story for some time. So, Anakin was not really an inspiration for Arthas, but the more interesting and main reason I've talked about this part with Anakin is that both Anakin and Arthas share an inspiration, though Anakin not directly, and that's Malus Darkblade. Malus Darkblade is a Warhammer fantasy character. And let's not hide behind the bush. The first Warcraft game could as well have been named Warhammer, with its humans versus orcs settings, the humans being the noble and rightful denizens of their kingdom, and then the orcs invading them. Hell, orcs in Warcraft 1 speak very similar to how orcs talk in Warhammer Fantasy, because they're dumb. But we're getting into more complex things right now. So, let's rewind and go back to our main topic. Both Malus and Arthas travel north to a land that is inhospitable and presents a danger to them. Arthas had to face off the undead, and Malus had to face off the corruption of chaos and all its chaotic denizens. Now, the reason they went north is different. Arthas did it for revenge, and Malus out of greed. But both of them find a hidden magical sword that ends up possessing them, and they both killed their fathers thanks to the sword. But we need to note some differences. First, Arthas is a human, and Malus is an elf, a dark elf. While Arthas and Malus both lose their souls once they grab their swords, Malus actually tries to win his back, and that results in him killing his own father for an artifact that would save him. Spoiler alert, I guess. Now, to go back to similarities, one that I find very funny is that Arthas serves the Lich King after he gets the sword, well, and even before he becomes the Lich King himself, and Malus serves the Witch King. Yeah, it's nice, I know. And now that we reach this point, we have to talk about something more important. And you can't talk about Malus and Arthas without bringing up the father of dark fantasy and cursed swords. I hope I pronounced this right. Elric of Melniboné. Yeah, probably that isn't right. Now, the inspiration line goes like this. It's Elric, then it's Malus, then it's Arthas. But here's something nice. There are some things that have been moved from Elric to Arthas, and one of the most prominent character features is basically when Arthas picks his sword Frostmourne and, well, loses his soul, his hair color changes. It becomes white, and in that aspect, both Elric and Arthas have white hair. And more interesting, in a twist of fate, they both find their end thanks to their cursed blades. But let's go into more similarities between these two. Elric at least gets the advantage of becoming the master of his own destiny, like Arthas does a little bit later on, but Arthas gets butchered by a Nope, I'm not getting into this right now. Both Elric and Arthas are connected to their swords, which is an interesting element that they don't share with Malus. In Malus's case, his soul is connected to the demon that was inside the sword, but Elric and Arthas are connected directly to their swords. Elric can't get rid of his sword, Stormbringer, no matter how much he might try, but Arthas is never away from his own sword. Think about this, in Warcraft 3, Arthas is never away from Frostmourne, and if I remember correctly from the Arthas book, Frostmourne is always at his side. Now, in the Halls of Reflection, there is that scene with Frostmourne just standing there on a pedestal, but that's more like a trap, so we'll ignore that thing. In comparison to Arthas and his Frostmourne, here's an interesting aspect. If Elric throws his sword in the ocean, it lodges itself there like it's Excalibur in the stone. Now, compared to Malus, Arthas becomes the Lich King, and Elric himself is the king of his own kingdom, which is Melniboné. Again, I'm gonna butcher that pronunciation, but let's move on. Their swords also share some interesting aspects. Both Stormbringer and Frostmourne hunger. And the only way to feed these little hungry swords is to feed them on souls. Now, Arthas in Warcraft 3, he starts out as a paladin, and we've already touched upon that subject. But once he acquires Frostmourne, he becomes a Death Knight, the first of the new Death Knight. Elric is a magic knight, capable of casting spells and fighting with his sword. And that's basically what a Death Knight does and, well, is. So, we marked another one. Also, another similarity between the two, or similarities, is the awesome name for the cursed blades. Frostmourne for Arthas and Stormbringer for Elric. And let's be honest, those sound like pretty cool name. But here's a more interesting fact about the swords. Frostmourne is a Mourn blade. We already established that in the Warcraft lore. Mourn blades are a thing. Technically, Shadowmourne should also be a Mourn blade, but we'll not gonna get into that. That name, the name for these type of blades, Mourn blade, that is still used in Warcraft right now, is the name of the brother sword of Stormbringer. Yes, the other blade in the Elric franchise is called Mournblade. Sometimes something else, because Elric also gets confusing with its multiverse traveling and time shenanigans, but we'll ignore that. Mournblade. As you can see, Arthas is based on quite a large selection of myths and fantasy stories. And it is in this vast inspiration that I think really leads into creating a character that is so well written and so well made that many people fell in love with it and Warcraft by itself. Now, as a side note, I recommend you read everything that inspired Arthas, especially Elric. You don't know what you're missing. You really want to get there. You want to read that. And also, Elric is kind of responsible for the Witcher series, more or less. That's a point of contention when it comes to these things. Now, let's look at Arthas' character. And, well, a little bit of analysis, if you will. Let's begin where it all started. His fall. Now, his fall is a topic that has many arguments. Maybe it was when he picked up Frostmourne, or when he purged Stratholme, or when he had to kill his steed Invincible to cut off his suffering. There's an argument to be made for all these points, and for what Warcraft 3 shows us, we can deduce that his fall happened after Stratholme in Northrend, where he burned, well, before he burned his men's ship. And clearly, by the time he picked Frostmourne, Arthas had already fallen from grace. Luckily for us, the Arthas book gives us a little bit more insight into this. Because you see, when Arthas wants to pick up Frostmourne, he gets this flickering thought about helping his mentor, Myrddin, that was injured by a shard of ice that once enveloped Frostmourne. But something made Arthas ignore his old friend and leave him to die. We can point to that moment. He gives in to the voice of Frostmourne to abandon his friend as being his final moment, his final decision as the Arthas we once knew. And if you would allow me to compare it to this to the story of Lucifer, that is the moment Lucifer lands in hell. So we reach the final point, but that still doesn't answer the question of where his fall really started. Now, I'm going to be generic with this, and I'll say this. His fall happened at Stratholme, when he was forced to kill his own men and people so they wouldn't turn into the undead and serve Mal'Ganis and the Lich King. While justified, it's clear that killing the people that you were supposed to defend would mess you up in the head. Sure, some people could say that his hand wasn't really forced there, that he had other options. But if you played Warcraft 3, other options were never presented. And to make a little joke here, the option of quarantining doesn't really work when you have a magical plague that could just be teleported to other places. After purging his own people, Arthas' main driving force is vengeance. The Drellor Mal'Ganis taunts him that their final battle will be in Northrend, and that pushes the young prince to come and pick up the Runeblade Frostmourne and continue his destiny. If we look at everything that happened in Warcraft 3, we see that everything was planned so that Arthas would fall, that he would pick up the cursed sword, and that he will destroy his own kingdom. In a way, Arthas is a tool of fate, much in the same way Elric is in his own world. While the Elric world is far more complex than the Warcraft one, the similarity in themes is hard to ignore. It was always the Lich King's plan for Kel'Thuzad to die, for Mal'Ganis to meet his end against Frostmourne, and for Arthas to become his champion. I know I just told you that Strahome was the moment of the fall, but would it be so far-fetched to say that his fall happened after Ner'zhul became the Lich King, while Arthas was still a child? Is your fate really your own if your fall is already planned before you are old enough to drink? I don't know. The Arthas book offers us many insights into Arthas before his fall, before Warcraft 3 even. It shows to us his relation with Jaina, Kel'Thas, his father, his sister, and even Varian Wrynn. There's no denying that he's human. When visiting the internment camps, he even decided to keep Tareta with him that night so she wouldn't be abused by Blackmore. Arthas is portrayed as a human before Warcraft 3. A man with virtues and, of course, flaws like any other. But it becomes surprising then when you see him turn to the monster that will kill his own father and burn his whole kingdom to the ground. Much in the same way Elric burns down his kingdom after he loses his throne and his love. Well, from his perspective, Arthas is only trying to do good by his people. His righteousness becomes his undoing, and the very catalyst that changes his fate from his own hands into the hands of a higher power. Many people, when looking at the story of Warcraft 3, seem to not go beyond the Reign of Chaos, which is unfortunate because the Frozen Throne made the game much better. So we will analyze Arthas from this position as well, because now in the Frozen Throne, his master is free, and Arthas is left to rule his broken kingdom. But that all changes when his powers start to diminish, and his master calls him to Northrend. In this expansion, we see an Arthas that we haven't really seen in the previous game. We see a weak Arthas. And in this journey, well, to the Lich King, Arthas manages to survive thanks to the help of the Lich King's other minions that help him along the way. Kel'Thuzad and Lordran, Anub'arak in Northrend, and during his battle with Illidan, Frostmourne itself. As a tool of fate, he climbs the steps of the Frozen Throne and gives the former Orc war chief Ner'zhul a body at last. But after this, the Arthas book comes in to complete what happens once Arthas puts on his head the helm of the Lich King. By this point, the Arthas that we have now is not the same one that we started with in the Reign of Chaos campaign. The Lich King and fate have changed him. The loss of his soul to Frostmourne even more so. With this information, we can jump in to what happens in the book next. Inside his own mind, Arthas is greeted by a younger version of himself, one that looks sickly. That is his last remaining humanity, the same one that showed his face for a moment when Arthas killed Sylvanas. Alongside his humanity is the Lich King himself, Ner'zhul. Both sides try to convince Arthas of something. His humanity to turn back to his former self, and Ner'zhul to combine with each other. Remember, in the Reign of Chaos campaign, Arthas was a tool of fate, and now he was given the power to decide his own destiny. So, with Frostmourne, or more like a mind Frostmourne, whatever, he cuts down his humanity. And while Ner'zhul laughs, he gets cut down too. No longer content with being a tool of fate, the former prince ascends to the position of the King of the Damned by killing his humanity and the orc that was once known as Ner'zhul. Now Arthas was the master of his own fate. Some years would pass on, and Warcraft would evolve from an RTS game and an RTS series to an MMORPG. And finally, on the 13th of November 2008, the Wrath of the Lich King expansion would be released for World of Warcraft. And it is here that we would meet Arthas once more. The Lich King had awakened, and this changed Arthas in such a way, well, that he's different from his other two previous versions, the one from Reign of Chaos and the one from the Frozen Throne. Design-wise, the Lich King looked in a way more like Sauron or the Witch King from Lord of the Rings. This time around going with a more classical and well-known design rather than a more obscure Elric one, because even his design was based on Elric, let's be honest now. Nevertheless, Arthas would be more arrogant and brutal now, much more different even from his Frozen Throne incarnation. The power of controlling the dead did really change him. What is interesting in his Wrath of the Lich King incarnation is his final moments. Once the Lich King is defeated and Frostmourne is broken, all the souls that the Cursed Blade had feasted upon get released. And that includes the soul of Arthas' father and that of his mentor, Uther the Lightbringer, and many more. But even more importantly, even the first soul Frostmourne had ever claimed, Arthas himself. And in his final moments, Arthas recovers his soul and his humanity, can be seen while asking his father if it's over. And, well, next follows a pretty amazing cinematic that I will post here because we can't really do anything without it.
Father, is it over?
At long last. No king rules forever, my son.
I see. Only darkness before me.
Arthas re-becomes human again. His former self, the one that had left long ago with Jaina to find the cause of the plague that infested his people. Yet the truth is that this Arthas had to endure the crimes that he had committed as an agent of fate and later on as his own master. Both Elric and Arthas would find their doom thanks to their swords, yet Elric would get a chance to become the master of his own fate later than Arthas. But Elric's story would have a sort of happy ending technically, while Arthas would end tragically. I think this is the problem with becoming the master of your own fate. Every decision you make now is yours to bear and deal with. And this was the inspiration and character analysis of Arthas, the tool of fate that would become king.
Forget this business. Lead your men home. You lost your mind, Arthas. You lied to your men and betrayed the mercenaries who fought for you. What's happening to you, Arthas?
Our prince will find only death.